What just happened at the G7 summit? Why was Donald Trump suddenly talking about the Strait of Hormuz? Why is Mark Carney paying close attention to events thousands of kilometers away in the Middle East? And most importantly, why should Canadians care? If you enjoy in-depth Canadian current affairs, global politics, and economic analysis from a Canadian perspective, consider subscribing to Canada Now. We break down the stories behind the headlines and explain what they mean for Canada, Canadian workers, and Canadian families. Because today's story is much bigger than a ceasefire. At first glance, it looked like another foreign policy update, another conflict, another diplomatic announcement, another meeting between world leaders. But beneath the surface, something much larger may be unfolding. As leaders arrived at the G7 summit, the mood appeared noticeably different from just a few days earlier. For weeks, global markets had been watching the growing tensions surrounding Iran. Energy traders were nervous. Governments were preparing for disruptions. Oil prices were moving sharply as investors worried that one of the world's most important shipping routes could become a battleground. Then came the announcement. Donald Trump declared that a deal had been reached and that the Strait of Hormuz would soon be fully operational once again. According to Trump, ships had already begun moving through the region, and normal operations could resume quickly. For many people, that may sound like a distant geopolitical event, but it is not. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another body of water on a map, it is one of the most important economic arteries on the planet. Nearly 1/5 of all globally traded oil passes through this narrow stretch of water between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. Think about that for a moment. Almost 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply moves through a single maritime corridor. When that corridor is threatened, energy markets react immediately. Oil prices move, shipping costs rise, businesses become uncertain, investments slow down, and eventually consumers begin to feel the impact, including Canadians. That's why this story matters. And that's why Mark Carney was paying such close attention during the G7 discussions. Because while Canada may be an energy-producing country, we do not operate in isolation. The global economy is deeply interconnected. What happens in the Middle East can influence prices at gas stations in Toronto. What happens in shipping lanes can affect manufacturers in Ontario. What happens to energy markets can impact inflation across the country. The world is more connected than ever before, and Carney understands that. That's why his comments were notably different from some of the more celebratory language coming from Washington. While Trump focused on the reopening of the strait and the success of the agreement, Carney focused on resilience. He focused on protecting supply chains. He focused on strengthening global commodity systems. And perhaps most importantly, he focused on preventing future disruptions from hurting ordinary people. That distinction matters because it reveals something important about how Canada is approaching an increasingly unstable world.
TV News' senior political correspondent Mike Locouture is covering the trip for us. He's with us live from Evian, France right now. Thanks, Mike, for staying up so late. I appreciate it. What is on the agenda as far as Prime Minister Carney and President Trump go?
Well, so far, no bilateral discussion. And, you know, for people who aren't into politics, that's essentially when they sit down together in a room for about half an hour or so and just have that one-on-one conversation. That's not on U.S. President Donald Trump's schedule. It's not on Prime Minister Mark Carney's schedule at this point. But, you know, Canadian officials have told us it doesn't mean that they're not going to talk at all. I mean, you just referenced the dinner, which wrapped up this evening. And, you know, at that type of dinner, you can't be any less than 3 seats away from it would be from Trump, from Carney. So it's unclear if they did talk at all about trade. But yesterday, Prime Minister Mark Carney essentially said that's not what he was planning to do if he was going to get any time with the U.S. president. He said he's going to leave it to his Minister of Trade with Canada and the United States, Dominic LeBlanc, who is going to be in Evian, France, as well as Janice Charette, who is the lead negotiator for Canada-U.S. negotiations. And and they're expected to meet with Jamieson Greer, the United States Trade Representative, talking to Dominic LaPlace's people. We have not heard just yet exactly when they will have that meeting. They said they'll get back to us when they have something to say. And at this hour, which is just a little past 11 o'clock here in France, we haven't heard anything yet.
What about the overall dynamic at the G7 with Trump there? I was asking the minister earlier about whether anyone's going to convey to the United States, there doesn't appear to have been much that changed before. And, we're kind of going back to a status quo before the Iran war. The issue of trade is obviously on the agenda, and there are, tariffs on basically every country represented there as applied by the United States. What is that dynamic? How do you expect that to unfold, Mike?
Well, I think we got a bit of a hint of it just ahead of the G7 when Emmanuel Macron was giving an interview. And he spoke very broadly, but then also talked about tariffs from the United States and saying they don't help anybody. He was very blunt in this French interview. And he said they certainly don't help fellow G7 nations when we put tariffs on each other. And he did say, that, look, there are tariffs that are not consummate when it comes to France and U.S. trade, and saying that the tariffs that you're putting on us are not equivalent to what we're putting on you. And he said that he wants the United States to address that. Now, whether or not he said that face-to-face to U.S. President Donald Trump, or if he's going to say that to him, that still remains a question. But to have Emmanuel Macron be that clear just ahead of the G7, sort of laying the groundwork for how a number of these countries are feeling, and maybe possibly talking a little more loudly about this, and not to say that they're being more bold, but certainly more confident and more, feeling together in this fight against the U.S. president when it comes to these tariffs. So it's unclear to see if they will band together to have this unified front, or if it's just Emmanuel Macron who's being as loud and as clear at this point.
If I recall from 2018, Donald Trump likes watching those press conferences and interviews of other leaders, and he can internalize what they say quite readily. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate your reporting tonight. Our senior political correspondent, Mike Lecouture in Evian, France, covering the G7 for us all week.
For Trump, the message was largely about securing a diplomatic victory and demonstrating leadership. For Carney, the message was about managing risk. Those are two very different approaches, and they reflect two very different visions of how government should respond to global uncertainty. But this story becomes even more interesting when we step back and ask a deeper question. Why is this issue suddenly dominating discussions at the G7? The answer goes far beyond Iran. What we're witnessing is part of a much bigger transformation in global politics. For decades, many countries assumed that international trade routes would remain open, that supply chains would function smoothly, that globalization would continue expanding, and that major powers would generally work together to keep the system stable. Today, those assumptions are being challenged. Wars, trade disputes, sanctions, geopolitical rivalries, economic coercion. All of these factors are forcing governments to rethink old strategies. And Canada is no exception. Over the past several years, we've seen repeated reminders of how vulnerable global systems can be. The pandemic exposed weaknesses in supply chains. The war in Ukraine disrupted energy markets. Trade disputes created uncertainty for exporters. And now tensions in the Middle East are once again reminding leaders how quickly global conditions can change. That is why resilience has become such an important word in modern policymaking. Not growth alone, not efficiency alone. Resilience, the ability to withstand shocks, the ability to adapt, the ability to continue functioning when the unexpected happens. And when Mark Carney talks about building stronger commodity systems and reducing vulnerabilities, that is exactly what he means. He is preparing Canada for a world that is becoming more uncertain, a world where economic security, energy security, and national security are increasingly connected. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. What happens next? Will the ceasefire hold? Will the Strait of Hormuz remain open? Will energy markets stabilize? Will G7 nations agree on new measures to protect global trade routes and supply chains? And what role will Canada play in a rapidly changing world? These are the questions world leaders are trying to answer right now. For Canada, the challenge is clear. Strengthen supply chains, expand trade partnerships, secure energy markets, and build an economy that can withstand future shocks. Because this G7 summit is not just about today's crisis, it is about preparing for tomorrow's. And in many ways, this may be one of the first major tests of how Mark Carney intends to position Canada on the global stage, not simply reacting to events, but helping shape the response to them. The decisions discussed today could affect Canada's economy, energy exports, trade relationships, and international influence for years to come. So while the headlines focus on ceasefires and diplomacy, the bigger story is how Canada prepares for a world that is becoming more competitive, more fragmented, and more unpredictable. What do you think? Is Canada on the right path? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe to Canada Now, hit the notification bell, and join us as we follow the stories shaping Canada's future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.